Arrogant judge laughs at black man. Minutes later, she's the one in trouble. Malcolm Pierce entered the courtroom with the quiet strength of a man who had weathered countless silent battles. His charcoal suit was sharp, his navy silk tie perfectly knotted. Every step echoed confidence, but it couldn't drown out the silent stares that trailed him. Cold, doubtful, judging. To them, he didn't belong. The security guard's stare lingered a second too long. A white-haired clerk squinted at him, as if wondering if he was lost. Even the stenographer, fingers hovering above her keys, seemed momentarily distracted by his presence. It wasn't the suit, it wasn't the briefcase, it was the color of his skin. Malcolm had been in rooms like this before, elegant in design but foul in soul. The high ceilings, wood-paneled walls, and rows of spectators gave the illusion of grandeur, of fairness. But what he felt wasn't justice, it was tension. A thick, choking kind of silence that crawled up your spine and whispered, "You're not welcome here." Then came the voice. "Mr. Pierce," Judge Eleanor Raines called out, her tone laced with disdain, her voice sharp enough to cut stone. "You're the defendant in this case?" Malcolm raised his head. "Yes, Your Honor." She squinted at him over the edge of her glasses, her lips curling in an amused sneer. "You're a licensed architect?" "I am." There was a pause, a calculated pause, and then she said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "An architect? I thought you were a model for designer suits." Some people in the gallery chuckled. Others looked away, ashamed but silent. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing a black man could do in a courtroom was show anger. The second most dangerous was show pride. Raines leaned back in her chair, as if thoroughly entertained by her own insult. "Let's proceed." The prosecution snickered. A young white district attorney named Granger Matthews stood ready, a cocky smile on his face. He glanced at Malcolm like a man who already knew the outcome. He probably did. The courtroom wasn't a battlefield, it was a trap. And today, Malcolm was the prey. As the hearing began, Malcolm's lawyer, a diligent but visibly nervous woman named Nina, stood to file a routine motion to exclude an inadmissible financial document obtained without a warrant. It was basic. It was procedural. It should have been accepted without hesitation. "Motion denied," Raines said without looking up. Nina blinked. "Your Honor, with respect, this document violates—" Raines raised a single finger. "I said denied. Don't test me today, Ms. Cho." That was the first of many rejections. Malcolm watched, a storm simmering beneath his composed surface, as every valid objection, every legal argument they offered, was shut down like a parent slapping a child's hand away from the table. Judge Raines didn't even pretend to be fair. She wasn't hiding her contempt, it was proudly on display. Weaponized with precision. Malcolm was used to being underestimated in boardrooms, side-eyed at job sites, dismissed in meetings. But this was different. This was institutional humiliation, sanctioned by a bench that had long forgotten what justice looked like. Raines's gaze flicked back to him often. She didn't need to say the words. They were written in the set of her mouth, the cold in her voice, the casual cruelty in every ruling. "Men like you don't build skyscrapers. Men like you don't win cases. Men like you shouldn't even be here." The air in the room grew denser with every minute, not from heat, but from the sheer weight of unfairness. It hung in the room like smoke, coating the lungs of everyone watching, even if they didn't want to admit it. The stenographer typed slower. The jury shifted uncomfortably. The gallery grew quieter, subdued not by respect, but by unease. Malcolm sat still, his hands folded on the table, watching Raines carefully. Every word, every glance, every ruling, he cataloged it all. He knew this wasn't about evidence. This was about image, about who society chose to believe. And in this room, truth didn't matter. What mattered was that a successful black architect had dared to defend himself against a white corporation accusing him of embezzlement, an accusation built on twisted numbers and racial assumptions. He was guilty the moment he stepped into the room. The trial was just the performance. Raines interrupted again. Mr. Pierce, please refrain from whispering to your attorney while the prosecution is speaking. It's distracting. Malcolm hadn't said a word. His eyes had met Nina's briefly. That was all. But in Raines's court, silence could be twisted into defiance. Presence alone was a threat. He nodded. Understood, Your Honor. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't like that. He was too calm, too contained, too in control. The bailiff leaned toward her and whispered something. She nodded, then banged the gavel once. Let's take a brief recess. I suggest the defense use this time to reconsider their approach. As people began to shuffle out, Malcolm remained seated, his fists clenched beneath the table, unseen, not out of fear, but fury, righteous, burning fury. He had done everything right, earned his degrees, built his firm from nothing, served his community. And still, here he was being stripped of his dignity in a courtroom supposedly built on justice. Nina whispered, "They're trying to provoke you. Don't give them anything." Malcolm's voice was low but steady. They already took everything they could. Now I'm just watching them dig their own hole. The courtroom doors creaked open again, this time not for drama, but for paperwork. A young intern from the prosecution side scurried forward with a thick file and handed it to the lead prosecutor, David Kensington. Tall, confident, and smug in the way only a man backed by power could be, Kensington stood up slowly, turning toward the jury like a seasoned actor taking center stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "today we present irrefutable proof that Mr. Malcolm Pierce intentionally misallocated $2.4 million from the Sycamore Heights development project into personal accounts disguised under shell corporations." Gas fluttered through the courtroom like flapping wings. The jury sat up straighter. Reporters in the gallery shifted forward, pens poised. All eyes turned to Malcolm, whose face remained still stone, carved under pressure. The screen behind the prosecutor lit up with a spreadsheet full of transaction codes, company names, dollar signs. A maze of numbers and names that to the average juror looked damning overwhelming even. "Now, of course," Kensington continued smoothly, "Mr. Pierce will claim these were clerical errors, that it was all a misunderstanding. But when money disappears, someone has to answer for it. And conveniently, every arrow seems to point back to one man." He gestured toward Malcolm like a magician unveiling the guilty card. It was theater carefully rehearsed, fully coordinated, and utterly deceptive. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice low but resonant. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to submit Exhibit 12B internal communications and whistleblower emails clearly implicating Mr. Adrian Steele, my former partner, as the one who rerouted those funds behind my back." Judge Raines didn't even glance up from her notes. "Denied." Silence. Nina, his attorney, looked stunned. "Your Honor, respectfully, Exhibit 12B contains time-stamped data and corroborating statements from multiple staff members." "I said denied," Raines snapped, finally looking up, her eyes cold and distant. "This isn't a forum for conspiracy theories." "Your Honor," Malcolm spoke directly now, voice controlled but urgent. "The document shows Adrian accessed the accounts from a remote server in Aspen on dates I was out of the country. It's all logged. This evidence—" "Mr. Pierce," she interrupted, waving a hand dismissively as if brushing away an annoying fly. "This is a court of law, not a TED Talk. I don't need your lectures. I need facts. And so far, the prosecution is the only side providing them." That wasn't just a dismissal. It was a slap across the face. The prosecutor smiled again, folding his arms behind his back, like the victory was already his. The judge had just handed him the match point before Malcolm could even serve. Malcolm's lips tightened. His pulse pounded beneath the collar of his shirt, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't. That was the game. Anger made you guilty. Composure made you invisible. And right now, invisibility wasn't an option. He turned slowly to the jury. "The emails aren't theories. They're traceable, documented, verified." "That's enough, Mr. Pierce," Judge Raines barked. "You're not an attorney. You're the defendant. Speak again out of turn, and I'll have you held in contempt." It hit like a hammer. The message was clear. Sit down. Shut up. Be grateful you're even allowed to breathe in here. Nina stood again, defiant. Your Honor, we must object. The refusal to admit exculpatory evidence violates due process and constitutes judicial bias. Careful, Ms. Cho, Rain said icily, her eyes narrowing. You're beginning to sound like your client, and if that continues, I won't hesitate to remove both of you. A cold hush fell over the courtroom. Malcolm sat back, jaw locked. He glanced at the jury. Some looked away. Others stared blankly, as if waiting to be told what to think. One man on the left, middle-aged, pale-faced, stiff, nodded ever so slightly at the prosecutor's last statement. Confirmation bias was setting in, and it was spreading like wildfire. Malcolm felt it. The walls tightening, the air thickening, the narrative twisting itself into a noose around his neck. Truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was who got to speak and who got silenced. The next witness stumbled to the stand like a man dragging the weight of his own uncertainty. Gregory Fallon, middle-aged, jittery, and visibly uncomfortable in his oversized blazer, barely made eye contact with the courtroom as he was sworn in. Malcolm recognized him immediately. Fallon had once been a subcontractor on a separate project years ago, fired for repeated delays and poor workmanship. Now somehow he was the prosecution's key witness. Kensington approached him like a lion circling a wounded gazelle, voice syrup smooth. Mr. Fallon, can you confirm that you overheard Mr. Pierce discussing creative accounting practices during a lunch meeting at Sycamore Heights? Fallon scratched his neck, glanced around and mumbled, I think so. You think so? Kensington echoed. Fallon nodded nervously. I mean, yeah, I was nearby. I heard him say something about moving funds to keep things fluid. From the defense table, Malcolm's lips parted in disbelief. That phrase, keep things fluid, was something Steele had said repeatedly. Never Malcolm, never once. But the courtroom didn't flinch. No one questioned the context. No one asked why Fallon, a fired contractor, had suddenly remembered a vague sentence from 2 years ago. Nina stood. Objection, Your Honor. This testimony is speculative and lacks foundation. Judge Raines didn't hesitate. Overruled. Nina pressed on. The witness was dismissed from the project over a year before this alleged meeting. There's no evidence he was present. This entire testimony— Ms. Cho! Raines snapped, voice rising like a warning siren. I will not allow you to hijack these proceedings with baseless objections. Another outburst, and you'll be sanctioned. The room froze. Nina sat down slowly, jaw clenched. Malcolm could see the fury building behind her calm facade, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. Not without risking removal from the case. Not without giving Raines exactly what she wanted. Fallon continued, stumbling through half-formed statements, contradicting himself mid-sentence. He said he needed to cover a shortfall, or maybe it was Steele who said it. I'm not sure. But the prosecution let it slide, acting as if every word was carved in stone. They didn't care about credibility. They cared about confusion, about perception. They were feeding the jury fragments and letting their biases assemble the rest. Malcolm's pulse pounded in his ears. He leaned forward slightly, voice low but cutting. He wasn't even there. Raines's gavel struck like thunder. Mr. Pierce, you do not have permission to speak. If you interrupt again, I will hold you in contempt. Malcolm sat back, fists tightening on his knees. His silence wasn't consent, it was survival. The audience, once curious, now sat stiff and unsettled. Whispers had evaporated. Even the journalists in the back had stopped scribbling. No one dared move. It felt like watching someone drown while being chained to the shore. The tension wasn't just thick, it was suffocating. Every word Fallon stammered out felt like another brick on Malcolm's back. Each contradiction should have unraveled the case. Instead, it slid past like water off armor. Protected not by fact, but by power. When Nina requested to cross-examine, Raines barely looked up. Make it quick, she said. Nina stood. Mr. Fallon, you mentioned a meeting in March. Are you aware that Mr. Pierce was out of the country that entire month on a recorded lecture tour? Fallon blinked. I didn't know that. And are you aware that Mr. Steele had full authority over the project's finances during that time? Another pause. I guess so. You guess. Or you know. Fallon fidgeted. I'm not sure. Nothing further, Nina said tightly and returned to her seat. But the damage had been done. Judge Raines didn't allow rebuttal, didn't address the inconsistency. Instead, she called for a recess like it was just another day in court, another routine moment of calculated injustice. Malcolm had barely shifted in his seat when Judge Raines's voice sliced through the courtroom like a blade through silk. "Mr. Pierce," she said, cold and loud enough for every corner of the gallery to hear, "do you really believe a few flashy contracts make you untouchable in this courtroom?" Malcolm didn't flinch, but the words hit harder than any gavel could. She leaned forward from the bench, narrowing her eyes like a predator circling its prey. "You may have charmed the media, Mr. Pierce. You may have built your little towers and strutted through your ribbon cuttings. But in this room," she jabbed a finger toward the marble floor, "you're just another man on trial, and you will respect that." Gasps rippled quietly across the gallery, followed by a silence so profound it felt like the air itself had been drained from the room. No one said a word. Not the bailiff, not the clerk, not the journalists, not even the other attorneys in the courtroom, some of whom had once shaken Malcolm's hand at industry events, praising him for breaking barriers they never had to face. Now they sat with eyes downcast, silent and still. No one dared cross the invisible line drawn by the judge's wrath. Malcolm remained calm, but his jaw locked tightly. His fingers curled around the edges of his seat, digging into the wood. He had expected bias. He had even anticipated manipulation. But this was a public execution of his dignity, dressed in judicial robes and hidden behind a wall of silence. "I have respected this court from the moment I stepped into it," he said slowly, voice low but steady. "But respect goes both ways, Your Honor." Raines's lips curled. "Is that supposed to be a threat?" "No," Malcolm replied, eyes unwavering. "That's a fact." Her gavel slammed down with force. "You're on thin ice, Mr. Pierce. Thin, cracking ice. You may be used to people applauding you out there." She gestured toward the windows, as if the city outside were beneath her contempt. "But in here, your reputation means nothing." Malcolm could hear the blood pumping in his ears, not from fear but from fury, a cold, calculated fury born from a lifetime of navigating spaces never meant for men like him. He had worked for every inch of ground. He stood on every contract, every blueprint, every sleepless night building something from nothing. And now, because he had dared to succeed, dared to defend himself, this courtroom had become his crucible. Raines wasn't just trying to win the case. She was trying to break him. "You really think," she continued, her voice dripping with disdain, "that just because a few people called you a pioneer, you're above the law? That your money, your press coverage, your style make you special? Let me tell you something, Mr. Pierce. You are not special. You are accountable just like anyone else." But that was the lie. That was the brutal irony, because Malcolm wasn't being treated like anyone else. Any other high-profile developer would have had their evidence reviewed, their witnesses heard, their objections considered. But not him. Not the black architect who dared to rise too far, too fast, in a system designed to keep him crawling. He glanced around the courtroom. No one met his eyes, not even the jurors, especially not the jurors. They looked straight ahead, frozen in their chairs, like children caught between feuding parents. They had seen the humiliation, the one-sided rulings, the cutting remarks, but none of them had spoken up. None had raised an eyebrow. The silence wasn't ignorance, it was complicity. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open again this time, not with authority or spectacle, but with quiet courage. Simone Avery stepped inside, heels clicking against the marble floor with a defiance that didn't need words. Her presence turned heads. A striking woman in her 30s, she carried herself with the kind of elegance that refused to be ignored. Her expression was calm, but her eyes locked on Malcolm with a heat that said everything. "I'm here. I've got you." Malcolm exhaled slowly, barely allowing himself to hope. He hadn't seen Simone in nearly 2 years, not since they parted ways to focus on their separate careers. But when news of the trial broke, she had reached out to his attorney. She hadn't come to rekindle anything. She came to speak the truth, and the truth mattered. Or so he thought. Simone took the stand with grace, but barely had time to state her name before Kensington stood up, tone sharp and smug. Objection, Your Honor. This witness has a personal history with the defendant, romantic in nature. Her testimony is inherently biased and inadmissible. Judge Raines didn't hesitate. Sustained. Ms. Avery's testimony is stricken from the record. Your Honor, Nina said standing, she's here to testify about a conversation she overheard between Mr. Steele and another investor information directly relevant to the missing funds. Doesn't matter, Raines snapped, already scribbling notes. She's emotionally compromised. The court cannot trust her objectivity. Malcolm's heart sank. Not from shock, he didn't have room for that anymore, but from confirmation. It didn't matter what Simone had to say. It didn't matter that her account directly contradicted the prosecution's timeline. The game had been rigged from the start. He looked over at Simone, who remained poised even as she was dismissed. Their eyes met. She gave him the smallest of nods, a silent message that she had tried, that she still believed in him. But belief alone couldn't penetrate the steel wall that surrounded this courtroom. As Simone was escorted out, Malcolm felt a heavy silence fall over everything. Not the kind born of order or control, but the kind that settles after a bomb drops. The kind that says, "You are alone." He turned back toward the bench, jaw clenched. His thoughts, once organized, now raced and collided inside his skull. This wasn't a trial. It was a staged execution, recorded and polished for an audience that didn't care about justice, only about the illusion of it. I didn't have a chance from the beginning, he thought bitterly. And he was right. The prosecution wasn't interested in the facts. The court wasn't interested in the truth. The judge wasn't interested in fairness. They weren't building a case, they were building a show where he was the villain and they were the noble keepers of the law. Malcolm glanced at the jury, eyes down, faces blank. He had seen that look before, at business dinners, at real estate summits, at investor meetings. The look of people who had already made up their minds but were waiting for permission to agree with power. Truth was irrelevant. In a courtroom like this, truth was noise background, static drowned out by rhetoric, costumes, and politics. What they needed wasn't a resolution. They needed a scapegoat. Someone to take the fall so they could all pat themselves on the back and pretend justice had been done. Malcolm stared at the ornate seal of the court hanging behind the judge's chair, a symbol that was supposed to represent equality and fairness. But right now it felt like a cruel joke. Justice wasn't blind. She was bought, coached, directed, and today she wore the mask of Eleanor Raines. Nina whispered beside him, "We can appeal. If they convict, we'll fight this. We'll take it to the circuit." Malcolm didn't respond. He didn't blink. His gaze was locked forward, eyes empty not from defeat, but from disillusionment. How do you appeal something that was never real? He looked up at the high windows, sunlight cutting in narrow beams across the floor. The light didn't reach him. Not really, not in here. He wasn't just on trial, he was on display. A black man accused of stealing from white developers, a narrative the media would eat up, a fall from grace that would sell headlines, a clean ending. They weren't after justice, they were after closure. Malcolm could almost hear the sound of editing scissors, his life being trimmed into a digestible broadcast segment. Architect turned con man, rising star meets justice, order restored. The cameraman in the gallery adjusted his lens, already prepping for the final shot. The prosecutors flipped through their notes, smug and casual, like they were tying a bow on a gift they never had to pay for. The walls closed in tighter. The space felt smaller, not just the room but the system itself. A shrinking, suffocating machine that chewed up men like Malcolm and spat them out as statistics. He clenched his fists under the table, nails digging into his palm. The pain grounded him, reminded him he was still here, still breathing, and yet he hadn't flinched. Not once. But now, it was time. Malcolm sat upright, hands calmly folded in front of him. His voice cut through the courtroom with a sharp clarity that felt unnatural in such a suffocating space. "Your Honor," he said, his tone neutral, too neutral. Judge Raines glanced at him with narrowed eyes. "Yes, Mr. Pierce," she replied, already irritated by the sound of his voice. Malcolm didn't blink. Would you mind publicly disclosing the nature of your relationship with Mr. Gerald Whitmore, the CEO of the Plaintiff Corporation? The air was sucked out of the room. Instantly. Every person in that courtroom, every juror, every reporter, every member of the gallery froze in place like statues trapped mid-motion. Even Kensington, the smug prosecutor, turned toward Malcolm with a sudden flicker of fear in his eyes. The silence that followed was so thick it felt like the floor might crack under the pressure. Judge Rain's expression hardened. Her fingers twitched, reaching instinctively for the gavel as though it were a weapon. She slammed it down with explosive force. "Out of order!" she roared, her voice echoing through the chamber. "Mr. Pierce, you will not disrespect this courtroom with baseless personal attacks." The gavel struck again. And again. "You are dangerously close to being held in contempt," she thundered. But Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't recoil. He didn't look away. He just leaned forward slightly and said, in a tone like steel sliding from a sheath, "You can remove me from the courtroom, Your Honor." He paused. "Well, but you can't remove the truth." A gasp rippled through the gallery like a wave striking a break wall. Judge Raines stood now, rising from the bench like a storm building to landfall. Her face flushed, lips curled in fury. "That is enough." Bailiff prepared to remove Mr. Pierce. But she was too late. The damage had already been done. Malcolm had spoken the words no one else dared say aloud. He had pulled the thread, and now the courtroom couldn't look away from the unraveling. The jurors exchanged nervous glances. The reporters in the back scrambled for their phones and notepads. Every camera in the room turned its lens toward the judge. Even the prosecutor looked pale. Raines hadn't denied it. She had only silenced it, and that silence was louder than any confession. "You think you're clever, Mr. Pierce," she hissed, trying to regain control. "Dragging my name into your desperation won't win you this case." Malcolm remained seated, unshaken. "My desperation?" he repeated softly. "No, Your Honor. This isn't desperation. This is exposure." The words landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. He was no longer just defending himself. He was indicting the system from within. "I've watched you bend every rule in this courtroom," he continued, voice sharp but composed. "You've overruled every valid objection, dismissed every critical witness, and humiliated me at every turn. And now, when I ask you to disclose a personal relationship with the very man whose company is suing me, you call it an attack?" The silence that followed was dangerous, charged, explosive. Raines looked like a cornered predator, desperate to bite, but nowhere left to run. "Mr. Pierce," she began, but her voice faltered, only slightly, but enough. Malcolm stood slowly, deliberately, not out of defiance, but out of finality. "You were never going to give me a fair trial," he said. "Not from day one, and I knew that. But I sat here anyway. I played your game. I followed the rules. I respected this court even when it disrespected me." He took one step forward. "But make no mistake, this isn't just about me. This is about every person who's ever stood in this room and been crushed by power dressed in robes." The audience was frozen. No one moved. No one breathed. The judge didn't speak. She couldn't, because deep down, she knew Malcolm was right. Malcolm's voice softened now, not in volume, but in intensity, like a fuse burning toward an inevitable blast. "You've made a career out of silencing people like me," he said. "People without the resources, without the connections, without the skin color that gets second chances. But here's what you don't understand, Your Honor." He looked her dead in the eyes. "People are watching now." Just as Judge Raines opened her mouth to reassert control, ready to slam the gavel again, ready to bury the last shred of truth Malcolm had unleashed, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a loud, echoing bang. Everyone turned. Two men in dark suits stepped through the entrance, moving with the kind of calm precision that sent ripples through the air. Federal agents. Their badges were already out, gleaming under the cold courtroom lights. Every step they took down the aisle was deliberate, unstoppable, as if the weight of justice itself followed in their wake. Gasps broke out across the gallery. Jurors leaned forward. Reporters dropped their pens. Even Kensington, the The smug prosecutor froze mid-sentence. Malcolm didn't move. He knew this wasn't about him. This was for him. The taller of the two agents spoke first, voice clipped, professional yet thunderous in its implication. "Judge Eleanor Raines," he said, his tone devoid of hesitation, "we have a federal warrant for your immediate arrest." The room didn't breathe. The sound alone seemed to paralyze every person present. Time slowed. The gavel slipped from Raines's hand and clattered uselessly against the bench. "This is a courtroom," she barked, eyes wild, desperate to reclaim her throne. "You can't just walk in here." "We can," the second agent interrupted, "and we are. Step down from the bench, Your Honor." Malcolm's heart pounded not with fear, but with vindication. After everything, after being silenced, discredited, humiliated in front of an entire system that had turned its back on him, this was the moment they couldn't deny. Raines stood frozen. Her lips trembled, searching for words that might save her. But none came. Not this time. "This is outrageous," she finally screamed, but her voice cracked. Weak now, lacking the fire that once scorched from the bench. "The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know." The lead agent didn't flinch as he stepped into the center of the courtroom, raising the official document like a blade of reckoning. "Judge Eleanor Raines," he announced, his voice sharp, unshaken, and unrelenting. "You are under federal investigation for accepting bribes, obstructing justice, and repeated violations of civil rights." A seismic wave of silence rippled across the room, the kind that carries weight, the kind that announces something irreversible has just occurred. For a moment, time stood still, then chaos. Judge Raines shot up from her seat, knocking her gavel from the bench. It clattered to the floor, forgotten. Her face, once the portrait of composed superiority, now twisted in a storm of panic and fury. "What?" she shrieked. "This is outrageous. This is him. It's him. He set me up." She jabbed a trembling finger at Malcolm, eyes wild and bloodshot. "He's the saboteur. That man is a manipulator, a criminal. This is a trap, do you hear me? A trap." The words echoed, but no one moved to support her. Not the court officers, not the prosecutor, not even her own staff. They all stood frozen as if witnessing the impossible unravel before them. Click. A camera flash lit the scene like lightning, then another, and another. The gallery had exploded into a storm of movement reporters scrambling for angles, jurors staring in disbelief, spectators murmuring in awe. Phones were raised. Pens raced across notepads. It was no longer a courtroom. It was history happening in real time. Through it all, Malcolm didn't move. He stood steady, still, silent. No smile, no celebration. Just calm, cold, piercing focus. Because this wasn't a surprise. He had seen this moment long before it arrived, imagined it in sleepless nights, rehearsed it in quiet solitude, prepared for it through years of patience and pain. This wasn't triumph, it was justice catching up. "I did nothing wrong," Raines shouted, voice cracking as the agents approached. "This is political. You're all making a terrible mistake." But her words fell like glass shattering, but sharp to no one. The agent read her rights aloud with mechanical precision. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Malcolm watched with eyes like steel, not empty, but forged by every ruling she twisted, every voice she silenced, every truth she buried beneath the weight of her gavel. There was no satisfaction in his gaze, only resolution. He didn't need to say a word, because Raines had just condemned herself, and the courtroom knew it. A murmur began to rise from the gallery, not one of chaos, but of something deeper, something rarer. Hope. It wasn't loud, it didn't roar, but it sparked in glances, in nods, in the slow realization that power could fall, that injustice could be unmasked, even in the most protected spaces. Malcolm stood in the center of that moment, like a monument to resistance. Not because he won, but because he never stopped fighting to be heard. And now, finally, the world was listening. The click of the handcuffs echoed like thunder in the cavernous courtroom. It was a small sound metal on metal, but it split the silence open like a scream. All eyes were locked on the woman who once ruled this room with a single glance. Now she stood paralyzed in disbelief, arms behind her back, wrists bound by steel. The very same wrists that had waved away justice with a flick, the hands that had wielded a gavel like a weapon. Judge Eleanor Raines, the queen of this courtroom, had finally been dethroned. Around her, chaos simmered. Gasps rose from the gallery, mingling with the flickering storm of camera flashes. Reporters leaned over railings, scribbling furiously. Members of the jury looked on in horror, some too stunned to process what they were seeing. And the attorneys who once bowed their heads in deference, they now stared as if watching the fall of a monument they had once mistaken for indestructible. Malcolm didn't flinch. He rose slowly from his seat, never taking his eyes off her. His movements were measured, deliberate, like every step was weighted with meaning, like every second had been carved from years of injustice and silence. Raines turned her head, her eyes locking with his, and in that moment, time collapsed between them. Gone were the robes. Gone was the bench. Gone was the illusion that she stood above him. Now they were face to face, equal, and the mask of power she had worn for decades had shattered under the spotlight of accountability. Her lips parted, whether to protest, to beg, or to curse, no one would ever know. Because Malcolm beat her to it. His voice, when it came, was low but searing. Each word carried the weight of every soul she had sentenced unfairly, every truth she had buried beneath biased rulings. "I didn't break the system," he said, staring directly into her eyes. "I just took out the trash." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was electric. The words hung in the air like smoke from a controlled explosion. They rolled through the room, landing on every corner, every ear, every heart that had been beaten down by the very institution she had corrupted. Rain's face twisted, first with rage, then shame, and finally, fear. Real fear. Because she understood. In front of the cameras, in front of the jury, in front of the country, Malcolm hadn't just exposed her. He had dismantled the myth she had built around herself. And he had done it not with shouting or vengeance, but with the quiet, unstoppable truth. One of the court officers, a man who had once risen when she entered the room, now stood beside her with a bowed head, not out of respect, but duty. He escorted her down from the bench she once ruled, her footsteps heavy, dragged by gravity and guilt. The sound of her heels, once so confident, now echoed like nails being hammered into the coffin of her legacy. The gallery watched, stunned and silent. The mighty had fallen, and no one stepped forward to catch her. As she was led past the defense table, Raines glanced again at Malcolm. But he had already looked away, not out of disrespect, but because her chapter was over, and he had more work to do. Behind them, the cameras kept rolling. The headlines were already forming. Federal judge arrested in courtroom corruption scandal. But to Malcolm, this wasn't about headlines. This was about repair. This was about every innocent person whose future she had destroyed with a crooked verdict. Every black man she had stared down with a smirk while denying evidence. Every voice she had silenced. Every life she had ground beneath her gavel. This was about them. This was for them. He turned toward the jury. They weren't moving. Their faces held a mix of shock and quiet recognition. For the first time, they weren't just seeing Malcolm as the accused. They were seeing him as a man who had dared to pull truth from the throat of a machine designed to erase it. Nina, his attorney, stood slowly beside him. "You okay?" she whispered. He nodded once. "Getting there." She didn't press. Outside the courthouse, sirens wailed in the distance. Protesters were already gathering. Supporters, skeptics, journalists shouting for comment. But in this moment, Malcolm didn't need to address anyone. His presence had spoken loud enough. He looked toward the empty bench where Judge Raines had once sat. The seat of power, the symbol of justice, it now looked hollow. And for the first time in years, that was the truth. The courtroom doors closed behind the agents and the fallen judge. The gavel lay abandoned on the floor, just beneath the bench, silent, powerless, irrelevant. Malcolm stepped forward, stopping at the spot where so many had stood shaking before her. He looked up. He breathed in. And in that moment, no shouts, no fanfare, just stillness. A man who had endured the fire stood in the ashes of corruption, not to celebrate, but to rebuild. Because cleaning up the system isn't glory, it's war. And he had just won the first battle. The courtroom doors swung open again, but this time, no chaos followed. No shouting, no flashing cameras, no agents in dark suits. Just a quiet shift in presence. A new judge stepped up to the bench. He was a tall, dignified man in his early 60s, his dark skin lined with the wisdom of decades spent navigating a system that too often worked against men like him. His name, Judge Harold Benton, carried weight in the legal community. He was known not for theatrics, but for unwavering fairness, for integrity that couldn't be bought, for eyes that saw through people, not over them. And in this room, that meant everything. He sat slowly, adjusting his glasses, letting the room settle under his calm authority. The energy shifted instantly. The audience, still shaken from Raines's arrest, leaned in. This was no longer a show. This was the moment where justice might finally return to its rightful place. Malcolm stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your Honor," he began, his tone strong but measured, "I move to have all charges against me dismissed, effective immediately." Judge Benton gave no immediate reply. He simply nodded once, inviting Malcolm to continue. "This trial was compromised from the beginning," Malcolm said. "Judge Raines manipulated evidence, silenced witnesses, and made rulings that violated the basic principles of due process." He paused, letting his words hang heavy in the air. "Today, she was arrested in this very courtroom for obstruction of justice and civil rights violations. That fact alone confirms what we've known all along. This wasn't a trial. It was a setup." The silence in the gallery was suffocating. Every person leaned forward. Even Kensington, the now pale and shaken prosecutor, sat completely still, his jaw clenched, his world cracking around him. Malcolm looked directly at the jury. "I never got a fair chance, but the truth broke through anyway. And now all I've ever asked is that this courtroom stop pretending it's blind when it already sees the truth." He turned back to the judge. "That truth demands this case be thrown out." The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Every face was turned toward Judge Harold Benton, the air heavy with anticipation, uncertainty, and something else, hope, fragile but rising. Benton, calm yet resolute, adjusted his dark-framed glasses and leaned slightly forward. His gaze swept the room methodically, absorbing the gravity of the moment. At the defense table, Malcolm Pierce stood silent and utterly still. The weight of months of accusation, ridicule, and despair pressed firmly onto his shoulders. Yet now something different had taken hold of his posture. A hint of defiance, a subtle power emanating from the realization that perhaps, at last, justice was close enough to touch. The courtroom was quiet, deathly quiet as Benton finally spoke, his voice deep, authoritative, and unwavering. "After careful consideration of all facts, testimonies, and recent revelations," Benton began slowly, deliberately, "this court concludes that the charges brought against Mr. Malcolm Pierce were irreparably tainted from the outset by severe judicial misconduct. The actions of former Judge Eleanor Raines have not only compromised this trial, but have severely damaged the very principles upon which our justice system is founded." Benton's words hung like thick smoke in the air. No one moved. No one breathed. "Given these unprecedented circumstances," he continued, each word landing like a blow to the crumbling remains of injustice, "the court has no alternative but to dismiss all charges against Mr. Malcolm Pierce immediately and unconditionally." There was an audible gasp from the gallery, relief, shock, joy mixing in a symphony of disbelief. Cameras clicked furiously. Reporters whispered into phones. Every pen raced across notepads in a desperate attempt to capture history unfolding. But Benton was not yet finished. He looked directly at Malcolm, his expression solemn yet filled with quiet respect. "Moreover, this court formally restores Mr. Pierce's freedom, reputation, and honor. It deeply regrets the injustice he has suffered under this roof." The apology echoed like a revelation. Never before had this courtroom openly acknowledged its own sins. Malcolm's jaw tightened briefly, emotion threatening to break through the stoic mask he'd worn for months. But he held firm, eyes fixed unwaveringly forward, a beacon of calm amidst the storm of unleashed emotions surrounding him. "Bailiff," Benton ordered gently, "remove the restraints from Mr. Pierce." The bailiff approached cautiously, keys jangling nervously in his hand, as if uncertain he had permission to free the very man who had been unjustly shackled in front of them. The silence intensified as the bailiff's trembling fingers reached for Malcolm's handcuffs. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly. He felt the steel bite one last time into his wrists, a bitter reminder of everything stolen from him, his dignity, his reputation, his very humanity, all chained by lies and prejudice. Then, with a decisive twist, the cuffs clicked open. The sound, metallic and sharp, resonated louder than a gunshot. It cut straight through the courtroom, reverberating off marble floors and wooden panels, a perfect symbol of justice finally striking through injustice. Malcolm opened his eyes slowly. His wrists were free. He lifted his hands, studying them, briefly marked, bruised but now unbound. The cuffs lay discarded on the table, cold metal relics of oppression no longer able to define his worth. Yet Malcolm didn't smile, didn't cheer. He simply raised his head, his expression fiercely resolute, a powerful reminder to everyone watching that freedom should never have needed defending in the first place. Benton's voice again filled the silence. "Mr. Pierce, you are officially and unequivocally free. The court extends to you its deepest respect and sincerest apologies." Malcolm nodded slightly, acknowledging the gravity of that statement. Then he turned toward the jury, who sat frozen, eyes wide, expressions strained between relief and shame. He spoke, voice clear and unwavering. "For months," he began softly but powerfully, "you've seen me treated as a criminal. You've seen evidence suppressed, witnesses silenced, truth mocked. You've seen power misused, the law twisted. You've seen justice herself bound and gagged." His gaze was intense, piercing each juror individually, forcing them to confront the reality they had willingly or unwillingly allowed. "But you've also just witnessed what happens when truth refuses to die. Today, you didn't set me free, truth did." He turned back toward the judge, his voice steady, yet now edged with raw emotion. "I appreciate the court's courage today, but the damage done here doesn't vanish with a single ruling. Others remain imprisoned by the same corruption, unseen, unheard, unnoticed. This victory isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone still fighting, still suffering in silence." The courtroom listened, captivated, awed by the sheer force of Malcolm's conviction. He took a measured step forward, turning slowly to the stunned gallery. "Don't celebrate yet. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning of a reckoning long overdue." Reporters scribbled frantically. The air buzzed with whispers, awe, and a rising tide of resolve. Malcolm moved calmly from the defense table, standing now in the aisle where his dignity had been dragged publicly through the mud, reclaimed inch by inch with each step forward. At the prosecution table, Kensington sat defeated, his earlier arrogance replaced by a vacant stare, his confidence shattered like glass upon stone. Malcolm glanced at him briefly, not with anger, but with something far more powerful, pity. Pity for a man who had believed that justice could be controlled, bought, corrupted without consequence. Malcolm continued toward the exit, each step heavy with symbolism, with triumph, with defiance. Yet just before reaching the doors, he paused, looking back at the room filled with faces etched with awe and respect. He raised his freed hand slightly, allowing everyone to see clearly, no more shackles. "Remember what happened here," he said, voice resonant and commanding, echoing with finality. "Remember, so no one else ever suffers injustice in silence." He pushed open the courtroom doors, stepping through, stepping out free, not just physically, but spiritually. In that powerful moment, the crowd behind him began rising to their feet. Quiet at first, then swelling louder claps of applause, cheers, cries of relief. Some embraced, some wept openly. Even seasoned journalists paused, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment they had just witnessed. Outside the courthouse steps, Malcolm inhaled deeply, breathing air as a free man, no longer burdened by false accusations and bitter prejudice. Sunlight warmed his face. He looked up into the clear blue sky, allowing himself one brief second of peace, a fleeting acknowledgement of triumph. But only for a moment, because his battle wasn't done. He knew too well that freedom today didn't erase the countless injustices hidden behind closed courtroom doors across the nation. He lowered his gaze, finding Simone waiting quietly at the base of the steps, eyes shining, proud yet understanding. She knew this moment wasn't the end either. It was only a crucial step toward something greater, something they would keep fighting for. Their eyes met. Without speaking, they knew. The war against injustice had just begun, and Malcolm Pierce had emerged as a symbol, bruised, scarred, yet unbroken. The man they tried to bury beneath the weight of falsehood had emerged stronger, determined, unyielding. Malcolm descended the steps with steady purpose, each stride reclaiming ground stolen from him by prejudice and corruption. Today had been a victory, yes, but he knew the work was just beginning. He would dedicate his newfound freedom to dismantling the corruption that had bound him, piece by piece, lie by lie, injustice by injustice. He would return to courtrooms not as the accused, but as the accuser. He would use his voice, his story, his scars to shine an uncompromising light upon a system desperately in need of reform. Behind him, applause continued, echoing off courthouse walls, a sound of justice regained, dignity restored, chains forever broken. Yet Malcolm walked on, driven not by personal victory, but by a deeper promise to those still silenced, to those still in chains. Today he was free. Tomorrow he would fight, and he would never stop fighting, because freedom, true freedom, required relentless courage, unending vigilance, and the understanding that justice must never be silent again. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Malcolm Pierce stepped out of the courthouse into a storm of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Reporters pressed forward with microphones, their voices colliding like thunderclaps. The sky above was overcast, but the glare of media lights felt hotter than midday sun. He moved through the crowd with purpose, each step echoing on marble steps like a drum beat. He had emerged from a trial rigged against him, battered by injustice, and yet unbroken. His name was plastered across every screen, his image spread across every news feed in real time. Onlookers craned their necks to glimpse the man who had dared to face a system built to silence him. The media swarm was relentless. Cameras spun around him, capturing every angle of his stoic face. The air smelled of camera lens spray, stale coffee, and the electric tension of a moment that had been years in the making. No one spoke above the roar of cameras and pounding heartbeats. He had become the story. Within hours, the world learned his name. Headlines blazed across televisions and internet homepages. News anchors repeated his story as if reading from a script destined for history. Social media erupted. Hashtags celebrating justice trended on platforms globally. Ordinary people who had never heard his name before now felt a personal stake in his vindication. Malcolm watched the coverage with a mixture of relief and sober realization. This was bigger than him. This was a reckoning. Invitations poured in before sunset. Journalists called nonstop. Editorial pages demanded interviews. Podcasts requested conversations. He refused none. He knew the power of this moment. He understood that he was now a symbol, a beacon for anyone who had ever been crushed by prejudice and power. His voice would amplify countless silenced truths. That evening, he appeared on national television. Studio lights blinded him as he took a seat opposite a polished anchor whose smile betrayed curiosity and awe. The questions came rapid fire. How did you endure the abuse? What do you want to tell others who face injustice? Malcolm answered each calmly but forcefully. His voice was steady steel. He described the cold contempt of the courtroom, the systematic efforts to erase his credibility, the suffocating weight of injustice that pressed down on every breath he took. He refused to soften his words. He refused to offer platitudes. His testimony was raw, honest, visceral. Viewers watched transfixed. His interview became the top trending clip within minutes. Within days, he founded the Pierce Justice Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to exposing systemic corruption and securing legal support for wrongfully accused people. He recruited former public defenders, investigative journalists, data analysts, and community activists. Their war room was a converted loft buzzing with energy. Walls were plastered with case timelines, flow charts, and photographs of clients whose lives had been shattered by false accusations. Each file represented a life-denied due process. The team worked around the clock, pulling every thread of evidence, identifying patterns of misconduct in courts nationwide. Malcolm led with fierce clarity. He refused to let this victory be isolated. He knew countless others remained trapped in the machinery of injustice. He embarked on a speaking tour that felt like an action sequence filmed on the streets of American cities. He arrived in Chicago to a throng of supporters gathered on courthouse steps. Cameras recorded his every word as he paced like a commander, leading troops into battle. His speech was a manifesto. He demanded transparency, accountability, and reform. He called out complacent judges, biased prosecutors, and broken systems. He did not call for revenge. He called for revolution of conscience. The crowd erupted, chanting his name, raising signs proclaiming solidarity with the oppressed. In New York City, he stood before a packed auditorium of law students and activists. Spotlights illuminated his profile as he recounted the crushing weight of being presumed guilty. He described each insult, each dismissal, each stolen breath of dignity. His words painted the courtroom as a battlefield, his journey as a mission to reclaim truth. The audience hung on every syllable, their emotions raw, their resolve hardened. He traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify before a congressional committee investigating judicial misconduct. Under harsh lights and piercing questions, he laid bare the rotten core of a system protected by indifference. Lawmakers listened, some nodding grimly, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. His testimony was a blow to complacency. Across the country, the narrative shifted. News outlets called him a hero. Editorials praised his courage. Social media influencers turned his image into a symbol printed on T-shirts and banners. He received honorary invitations to speak at universities and conventions. But Malcolm remained grounded. The fellows dispersed to work on cold cases, re-examine evidence, and prepare motions that challenged decades of misconduct. In Washington, D.C., he met with lawmakers again, this time armed with data and first-person accounts. He sat at a long polished table in a congressional hearing room, flanked by former inmates whose eyes bore the weight of lost years. He delivered a testimony so searing that several representatives wiped tears from their eyes. Bills to reform prosecutorial misconduct and expand compensation for the wrongfully imprisoned were drafted that day. The press hailed it as a legislative turning point. Malcolm traveled next to Geneva, where he addressed a United Nations panel on human rights abuses in domestic legal systems. Under the bright lights of an international stage, he spoke with conviction, demanding global scrutiny of a system that had claimed his life for a moment. Delegates nodded, diplomats scribbled notes, and news crews recorded every word for international broadcasts. Despite the whirlwind of activity, Malcolm never lost sight of individual stories. He spent weekends visiting clients released through his initiative, helping them navigate re-entry into society. He organized job training workshops, mental health counseling sessions, and community celebrations marking freedom regained. Each reunion was a reminder of what was at stake, a life given back, piece by piece. His calendar overflowed with speaking engagements, court filings, and strategic planning sessions. Yet each morning before sunrise, he rose alone for a quiet ritual. He would stare at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, looking into the eyes of a man who had endured the unimaginable and emerged with purpose instead of bitterness. He would recite a simple vow: "For every injustice faced, we will bring justice forward." By the time a year had passed since his release, Malcolm Pierce had transcended the title of exonerated defendant. He was a movement. He was a reckoning. He was a living symbol that change was not only possible, it was inevitable when truth and courage collided. And his journey was far from over. He was just getting started. Malcolm knew that every victory carried the weight of lives. He would continue to speak truth to power, to shine light into hidden corners of injustice. His story had sparked a conversation and mobilized communities to demand accountability. But he remained restless, driven by the knowledge that the fight for justice never ends. With each speech, each court motion, each conversation, He forged a path toward a world where freedom was a right, not a privilege. His mission was clear: relentless pursuit of justice for all. Malcolm Pierce walked out of that courtroom not just a free man, but a symbol carved from fire, forged in injustice, and risen with purpose. He had stared down a system that tried to silence him, and in return, made the world listen. The chains may be gone, but the scars remain not just on his wrists, but on every soul who has ever been crushed beneath the weight of a biased gavel. And so we ask you, don't scroll past. Don't turn away. If you believe in justice, don't stay silent. Share this story. Like, comment, and subscribe so justice becomes a right, not a privilege.